we are delighted to welcome first Smilen Markov and then Philipp Heckmann-Umhau to our today's speaker. And let me just jump right in and introduce Smilen. He was born on the Black Sea and went on to complete a PhD at the University of Cologne, which happens to be my birth city. And he is at present assistant professor in Christian philosophy and Byzantine theology at the theological faculty at the University of Veliko, Tarnov, and also a lecturer in ancient philosophy at the University of Bulgaria. He is also relevant for his talk today, a member of the German Society for Medieval and Renaissance Philosophy, as well as the International Society for the Study of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy, and an editor of Philosophia, which is an e-journal for philosophy and culture. He will speak to us about Edith Stein concept of personal time and its parallel in Byzantine philosophy, and we are very excited to have you, so thank you, and take it away.
Thank you, Konstantin, for your kind invitation and for the pleasure of being with you this afternoon, this late afternoon this year. So without further ado, I'll begin. I'll begin by showing you a photo which was, can you see it? Can you see the photo?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
This photo was taken in the so-called Redemptoris Mater Chapel in Vatican Palace on the second floor. The chapel is not normally open to the general public, and a friend of mine managed to squeeze in there. The mosaic you see is a work of a Slovene Jesuit priest, Rupnik, and is called the ecumenical mosaic, as it depicts modern saints of the Orthodox and of the Catholic Church. In the left corner, you see a figure, female figure, actually a nun, kneeling near a bush in meditation. This is Edith Stein, a saint of the Catholic Church, was a philosopher and a nun. The scene is the figure is quite near the burning bush, as you see, alluding to the episode from the Old Testament in which Moses saw a burning bush, and this was an epiphany of God. Well, this is quite an insightful depiction, to my opinion, of the person of Edith Stein, because she combines a life of rigorous philosophical search of the truth with the contemplative monastic habit. And Moses is the one who asks God his name, who formulates concepts of God, but also who has this experience of vivid, unmediated meditation of the unfathomable divine glory. And the burning bush itself is an exemplification of what is accessible, yet completely unutterable. Because, as you know, the bush is never consumed by the fire. But I don't know if you can see, but the bush, there is the thorns of the bush actually are stylized as barbed wire. And it's an allusion to the wire which surrounded the concentration camp in Auschwitz, where Edith Stein died in 1942. Being a Jew, she was arrested in a monastery, in a Carmelite monastery in the Netherlands, held in a concentration camp there, together with other baptized Jews, and then deported to Germany. It's noteworthy that a Dutch officer offered her a plan for escape, which she vehemently refused. But I think the mosaic you see is congenial with the spirit of Edith Stein, also in another perspective. Through her deep study of Thomas Aquinas, she got acquainted with the legacy of Byzantine philosophy and theology, and more specifically with the so-called Corpus Dionysiacum. This is a very strange, very interesting, and enigmatic collection of texts of dating from the 6th century, according to scholars, texts of profound philosophical and theological depth, which are traditionally ascribed to the disciple of St. Paul, the Dionysius, Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the first bishop of Athens. Well, her interest in these texts grew as time passed by, and led her to write the writing of a special monography on Dionysius, and also to the editing of the German translation of the Corpus Dionysiacum. And I can assure you that it is the best German translation of Pseudo Dionysius even today. A pivotal concept, but let's come back to the bush and to the figure kneeling near the bush. A pivotal concept in the Corpus Dionysiacum, as well as in Byzantine philosophy and theology in general, is the possibility of real participation of the divine life through the so-called divine energies. They reveal the active and living divine presence in creation. So, for Byzantine authors, the burning bush which Moses saw is very often given, they give it as an example of this permeation of divine energies in creation without destroying the natural boundaries, the properties of creation, and more specifically, of course, of the human nature and the human bodily substrate. On the contrary, all powers of a human being are given access to divine life. So that's why I think it's a good depiction of Edith Stein's personality. Her encounter with Byzantine theology is but a fragment of her immense intellectual oeuvre. Nevertheless, it's important, not only for her decision to convert to Christianity and eventually to take up the monastic habit, but also for her philosophical project. In sum, this project boils down to, of course, further development of the method and of the philosophy of her renowned teacher, no less a figure than Edmund Husserl. But also not only development, but also correction, to some extent, correction of the phenomenological method. I'm not going to retell here the biography of Edith Stein. Everybody can, I think you know most of it, and everybody can delve into further details. But it is important that, as a student, she met Edmund Husserl, and was one of his, according to his own words, she was his best student. The problem with her was that she was obviously a woman, and at that time, at least under his advice, she abandoned the idea of an academic career. If that is a pity, well, it's another issue. And she was co-working with people like Heidegger and Martius and others. So we are talking here of a philosopher of first rank, so to say. Now, what were the ways and instigations for Edith Stein to encounter Byzantine philosophy and theology? Of course, Thomas Aquinas and the work of Thomas Aquinas. But we have to be mindful that her interest in the past and in the history of philosophy and theology is not a mere intellectual adventure or a desire to delve deeper into the tradition, just for the sake of admiring it. A tradition, to be sure, which is very alien to the intellectual milieu in which she herself grew up as a thinker. But for her, the work with scholastic authors and with medieval authors and with church fathers in general is philosophical and a project of joint seeking of philosophical truth and philosophical perspectives. Joint, I mean, together with the authors. She considers these old ancient authors like co-workers, partners, and she comes into dialogue with them. She doesn't merely quote them or refer to them or use them as authorities. And many of these medieval authors, Thomas Aquinas is one case, but she worked with many others, such as Duns Scotus. They quote Dionysius. But she was curious to try to reconstruct the context of the ideas and to gain a perspective from which she could find and notice aspects and consequences from the arguments. She was very creative. Thus, in her fundamental philosophical work, Finite and Eternal Being, Endliches und Ewiges Sein, she uses Dionysius not merely as a source of concepts who supports her own arguments, but as a partner and as an instructor who is leading her in her own speculation. There were other Byzantine authors, however, that she got acquainted with, and unfortunately we don't have enough proofs for her readings of these authors. But the very fact that Thomas Aquinas quotes John Damascene and important concepts of John Damascene are adopted and transformed in Thomas's oeuvre. And when we keep in mind that John Damascene is a systematizer of the Byzantine tradition, this is one very probable conduit for connecting her thought with Byzantine philosophy. Let me give one example. In her fictional dialogue between Edmund Husserl and Thomas Aquinas, a text she proposed for the volume, for the Festschrift, dedicated to her teacher. And unfortunately, this text was never published in its original form because Martin Heidegger, who was at that time the director of the Jahrbuch and responsible for the publication, he advised her to render the dialogue in a plain text article. But in this dialogue, we have some fragments in this from this dialogue, from her diaries, and she says the following, I quote, "We are both," so this is Thomas Aquinas speaking, "we are both convinced, both, that's Husserl and Thomas Aquinas, that a logos is the force behind all that is, and that our understanding can uncover, step by step, first one aspect of that logos, then another." Well, the idea that there is a principle, a fundamental principle of being, which determines our knowledge of being, but is not an obvious entity, is not something that is immediately known, is actually an idea which is very close to the understanding of the logos of the essence, logos theousios, in Byzantine philosophy. And I don't mean here only theology, pertaining to the divine essence, but all essences. All essences have their logi, their principles. These principles are never completely grasped, but human mind can asymptotically approximate to their core. So in that sense, I see a parallel, which is a conceptual one, without having a clear trace of influence, of adoption. But of course, ideas, they travel not only via footnotes, they travel sometimes via allusions or associations, and there are many, many, many sources, even talks like this one. So the instigation of Edith Stein to delve into Dionysius is not only her own subjective project, idea, or dream. On the contrary, this corresponds to a movement, or she's part of a movement which was initiated by a very important figure within the German school of the history of philosophy, Martin Grabmann. He's responsible for the rekindled interest towards medieval philosophy in Germany during the 20th century. And he had many co-workers, and they undertook different projects of translating medieval philosophical stuff and popularizing it, but again, not with the purpose of just making an archive of the past. On the contrary, they wanted to take part in the modern debates, and they considered themselves as philosophers, as moving forward the philosophical investigation. I'd like to inspect in more detail some concepts, and I'll skip a lot because we don't have a lot of time. Just to show you how Edith Stein's project works. In his letters, the author of the Corpus Dionysiacum, or we can say Pseudo-Dionysius, states that he intends to develop an intermediary form of theology, which is between the traditional discursive philosophical theology and the pure contemplation, which is accessible for the pure, for the saints. And this intermediary stage of theology he calls symbolic theology. Although he does not give a detailed account of what this method might look like, one can infer that it presupposes a certain degree of immediacy with which a human person knows God. Edith Stein takes upon herself the task of developing this method of theology. For this purpose, she constructs a concept of the image which has two different aspects. One of them, according to the first one, the image is a representation, Darstellung, and the other aspect is the image as a revelation. Now, the representation is has the function of a sign bearing a certain meaning. This meaning may be expressed in the form of a visual depiction, a word, or a mental concept. The representation always relies on the process of recognition, which takes into consideration certain conventions of meaning, and theology and philosophy is full of such images of the divine. Now, a symbol is something different. The symbol works, so to say, in the very fact of its being. By virtue of its existence, a thing is a symbol, provided that it plays a role in divine revelation, according to its ontological capacities. In that sense, Edith Stein claims. The symbolic theology sketched by Dionysius isn't a human attempt for intellectual ascent to the divine. Rather, it is God's initiative for illuminating the human being. In symbolic theology, it is God that theologizes and not man. And Edith Stein was very much attracted by this idea that this is not a construction of human intellect, it's something self-revealing. Like God is the first and original theologian, she keeps repeating, der Urtheologe. The symbolic illumination takes place through the hierarchy of being, and here she makes use of another typical concept from the Corpus Dionysiacum, namely the hierarchy. Nowadays, we often misinterpret this concept as authority, power, oppression, subordination, but a hierarchy is, in fact, a concept, a gnoseological concept, and a concept of symbolic meaning. And Edith Stein wants to reconstruct this original context. In her monography on the Corpus Dionysiacum, Wege der Gotteserkenntnis, Edith Stein points out that some of the fundamental human notions of God enlisted by Dionysius, which Dionysius calls divine names, are in fact products of symbolic theology. And mind you, these names or concepts, they are not created by Dionysius. That are not his own invention. They are already present in Plato in the characterization of true being. The difference being, of course, that Dionysius attributes them to God. Edith Stein wants to show that these foundational, we can say, concepts such as good, being, one, are not normal rational concepts of God that are immediately accessible through reasoning, through definition. For instance, there isn't a representation of divine goodness through which God reveals himself. We cannot make a proper analogy. And in here, she says the normal analogies which we use when talking of the divine, they just don't work. In other words, divine goodness is not manifested through representative signs. How is it possible then for someone to know that God is good, or that God is being, or that God is one? The process of revealing these attributes transcends what Edith Stein calls the level of natural knowledge, in which the signs and representations are embedded, and we build concepts based on these signs and representations. This revelation does not repeal the hiddenness. At stake is a mystic revelation, geheimnisvolle Offenbarung, which does not repeal the hiddenness of God. Rather, at stake is a dialectical relation between hiddenness and unhiddenness. I have 7 minutes more. In order to illustrate this revealed but not abolished hiddenness, Edith Stein refers to another methodological model of pseudo-Dionysius, namely the synthesis between negative and affirmative predication of divine attributes, or the so-called apophatic and cataphatic theology. Although Dionysius proposes this model only for the discursive or philosophical theology, she is convinced. She deems it applicable also for the realm of symbolic theology. But this time, it is not concepts that are affirmed and then negated. The negation and affirmation are aspects of a lived experience, Erlebnis. And Erlebnis is a key concept in phenomenology. So it's not by chance that she tackles this aspect. Stein describes the trajectory of this dialectic of the personal experience elsewhere, but here in this monography on Dionysius, she notes that when speaking of God as the original theologian, she means exactly that it is God that initiates a process of negation and affirmation within the personal being, within the unique personal being. And it is on this level of experience that God is recognized as good, being, and one. So this is a specific level of personalistic or personological knowledge of God. Now, of course, how the question arises: how can one articulate this experience? How can one share it with the others to make it meaningful? And here she says, well, this happens through the signs and images, of course, but it is not that the signs and images are, so to say, arbitrary articulations of the experience. The proper signs and images that properly express this mystic knowledge, they are born, they're constructed within the situation in which the person, the symbolic theologian, meets or encounters the others. And the others are drawn in dialogue with this person. And they begin to talk about him and about this experience. And in this dialogue, they use certain concepts. And it is their usage that validates the concept. It's not the subject of symbolic knowledge that, so to say, constructs these ideas. And this dialogue is constitutive for the living within this experience. Then the symbolic theologian makes a transition between the articulation of the personal experience and the traces of divine living presence in other spheres of reality, namely the natural world or human history or the world of science. Thus, the language of theology becomes intelligible and explicative of different realities and of reality in general. There is, so to say, a return from theology to ontology, but it is now an ontology which is symbolically enriched. From this perspective of mystical theology, which is indebted to Corpus Dionysiacum, Edith Stein addresses one fundamental problem in the phenomenological method of her teacher, Edmund Husserl. For Husserl, philosophy came to be viewed as transcendental phenomenology, which means that an analysis of the subjective structures, that transcendental phenomenology is analysis of the subjective structures out of which the individual subject, the individual subjective world may be legitimately and intersubjectively formed, that is to say, can be shared. The subjective experience can be shared in a meaningful and what Husserl calls a scientific way with the others. All meaning for Husserl is intentional. It is constituent of the subjective consciousness. So when referring to things, we do not do that as if they are things in the outer world, but we point to them as constituents of our own consciousness. But how is it possible then to share meaning with the others, because they have their own consciousness and their own intentionality? What is the general ground, the common ground here? This is a big methodological problem. So how is intersubjectivity possible? Husserl, of course, developed some formal criteria for sharing this experience, and this sharing, still it has problems because it's difficult to think of it as a living experience, as Erlebnis. And by characterizing symbolic theology as a dialectic of the person, initiated by God, of course, Edith Stein signals that there is intentionality, that we can think of intentionality which is not primarily directed to objects, but to unique persons. And in this intentionality, the persons are not passive, they are dialogical partners. So in a situation of encounter between persons, this intentionality produces a self-evident horizon of shared meaning. That is the meaning of intersubjectivity. And of course, this method for Edith Stein has also theological implications, because from here she develops a Christology based on the symbol, Christ being the incarnate Word of God and being the first symbolic theologian. He's the symbol, the original, the first symbol. But she always keeps in mind the relevance of her work with Dionysius to the philosophical debates and problems. And she's brave enough to criticize her own teacher and to correct him. And I think it's a very, very interesting piece of intellectual history, of German intellectual history, but and also European intellectual history, this entire over. I have many other examples, but I think my time is over, and I think for now this could suffice. So I will rest my case here. And thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Smilen. Thank you so much for this demanding but very interesting talk. And we will take questions, but combine them at the end and listen to Philipp first. Philipp Heckmann-Umhau is one of our own, so he's an architecture BA at King's in Cambridge, and left Cambridge for a brief period to conduct an MSc in economics at the LSE, but luckily returned to us and is now completing his PhD on, well, I suppose he can tell you himself, but on two cities in late 19th and I believe early 20th century, Strasbourg and Sarajevo, and he's comparing them, but he will tell you much more about that. So Philipp, here you go.
Okay, thank you very much, Konstantin. And yes, very excited to speak to you chosen few. And you're the first ones who I share this idea with, that I've been working on for the last few months on the Protestants and the Garden City in the German Empire. And this is a topic that, as someone who's coming from architecture, garden cities are immensely important in every undergraduate introduction to architecture. You know, a central part of the way architecture is still being taught today. Now, here I'm interested in hearing from you, perhaps, whether and in how far this this exploration is also relevant to a historian rather than someone with interest in architecture primarily. And let me just share my screen. Trying to get a slideshow. Yes, okay. Is this working?
I think not yet. Here you go.
Yeah.
Yep, we're here. Good. Okay, great. The Garden City is one of the most important singular ideas in the history of urban planning. It's one of the first radical attempts to reform the modern city. It's a key step in the development of modern architecture, and it's still a much used paradigm when we discuss the way in which 21st century cities should develop. The Garden City is known as a British invention. Its credited originator, Ebenezer Howard, an obscure shorthand writer in the Houses of Parliament, rose to fame in 1898 with his book, Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, in which he popularized the Garden City idea. Recognizing both the vices and advantages of urbanization, Howard proposed to combine the amenities of the city and of country life in a new kind of model settlement that he called the Garden City. And this is one of his most important diagrams, the so-called three magnets, where he combines the pull factors of town, the pull factors of country life in his new combination, the Garden City. Its inhabitants would benefit from fresh air, greenery, and cheap rents, but still enjoy access to the amenities that make urban life so irresistible, namely professional and cultural opportunities. Garden cities should be low rise, low density, and never exceed a population of 30,000. They should be set apart from existing conurbations, separated by a green belt, which provided recreational spaces. In short, Ebenezer Howard's Garden City was a radical challenge to the state of most cities at the turn of the 20th century. Now, as anybody who's traveled on a train from London to Cambridge can attest, it didn't take long before the idea took off. A year after Howard's publication, the British Garden City Association was founded, reissuing his book under the more memorable title, Garden Cities of Tomorrow, and helping to develop Britain's first garden city at Letchworth. Others followed, most importantly Welwyn on the same train line, and Hampstead Garden Suburb in North London. These are the best known examples today. However, Britain wasn't the only country with a thriving garden city. Germany had its own Garden City Association, founded in 1902, and its own garden cities. The first one, Hellerau, here on the right, developed a mere 3 years after Letchworth. By the eve of the First World War, there were more than 30 communities in the German Empire that called themselves Garden City or Garden Settlement. Yet little is known about the German Garden City. Most histories of architecture and urban planning omit this topic entirely, which is the more surprising since Germany features heavily in almost all other aspects of design history of that period. When the Royal Institute of British Architects organized its first town planning exhibition in 1910, to the German Empire as the world leader and key innovator in urban planning. Why then has Garden City in Germany received such scant attention? The main reason, I suspect, is that Germany's Garden City tradition preceded the British, and it wasn't a proud tradition. 2 years before Howard, the German Theodor Fritsch published a work that claimed to have invented the Garden City. Like Howard, he advocated the foundation of extra urban settlements as a means to reform wider society. Like Howard, he was a self-made man with a patchy career trajectory. But unlike Howard, he was also one of the most prolific anti-Semites in Europe. When he published Die Stadt der Zukunft, Fritsch was already known as an unrelenting racist of the most vociferous kind. The late Nietzsche had called him a noisy imposter, noting in private that there existed, quote, no more impudent and stupid group in Germany than Fritsch and his acolytes of the Anti-Semitic League. Fritsch's unsubtly named journal Der Hammer would become a chief source of inspiration for Hitler. In the Third Reich, he was hailed posthumously as a prophet of National Socialism, had streets and monuments commemorating him throughout Germany. Fritsch was no exception in the German Garden City movement. Several leading members of the Garden City Association, such as Ernst Haeckel, Alfred Plötz, and Alfred Grojan, became chief advocates of the concept of racial hygiene. The fact that an extreme racist tradition preceded Howard poses a serious threat to the preferred narrative of the Garden City as a transnational liberal utopia. Fritsch never tired of accusing Howard of intellectual theft, adding that his successful British counterpart was, quote, probably a Jew. The delicate accusation of plagiarism has remained impossible to verify or disprove. Indeed, the mere possibility that an extreme racist conceived of the Garden City prior to Howard poses a heavy burden on the whole concept. Any rigorous examination of the roots and motivations of the Garden City movement in Germany may seriously endanger the tendency to view the Garden City as quintessential liberal idea on the trajectory to international modernism. Now, as present-day Germany renews its determination to expunge racists and anti-Semites from street signs and pedestals, there's reason to be ever more critical of the problematic associations of the Garden City movement. Rather than shun its exploration, I try to reappraise it. In exploring a much older strand of the Garden City tradition, I trace its roots in Protestantism, an admittedly unorthodox approach, since garden cities have been commonly understood as centers of secular urbanity, where community centers take the place of places of worship. I shall argue that Protestant reform paved the way for the garden city much before the concept was claimed by Fritz's anti-Semites. And what's more, it was the Protestant connection that helped the Howardian brand of the garden city to its ultimate triumph over Fritz's claims to the idea. The garden city was never the exclusive domain of the far right. Ebenezer Howard's garden city did not emerge from nowhere. The often credited originator of the idea claimed not to have invented the concept. His main merit lay in synthesizing a string of existing reform ideas into a coherent urban vision. By the time of his writing, almost none of the elements of his work were in themselves new, as little as the term garden city itself. Howard was indebted to a century of reform thinking. People like Thomas Spence, William Blake, William Morris, and philanthropists such as Robert Owen and the Cadburys. It is unsurprising that Britain produced such a wealth of reform thinking early on. The problems of urbanization and industrialization were most evident in its metropolitan centers, such as London, Glasgow, or Manchester. But not only. Germany was late to the game of urbanization, but it caught up in an intense sprint. While London was certainly Europe's largest city, at the time it wasn't its fastest growing. Berlin was arguably more dynamic, with little more than 170,000 inhabitants in 1800. By 1900, it had increased its size by factor 11 to 1.9 million, and in 1920, Greater Berlin was the world's third largest metropolis, with almost 4 million inhabitants, exceeded only by London and New York. Berlin developed its own reformist dynamism. 3 years after the foundation of the empire, in 1874, a book appeared entitled Die Großstädte in ihrer Wohnungsnot by an author called Arminius. It's not only arguably the first treatise on urban planning in the German language, but it also preempts many of the core demands of the later Garden City movement. Firstly, it proposed to constrain the growth of cities to amenable dimensions. Secondly, it introduced the idea of a green belt to prevent urban sprawl, but also to serve as a recreational facility for all citizens. Thirdly, it proposed to develop new model settlements, so-called workers' colonies, beyond the green belt with low-rise, low-cost housing in which land should be owned collectively. And fourthly, it suffused the overall vision of the reformed city with greenery, private and communal gardens, aiming to reconnect the urban working classes not only with fresh air, but also with agricultural production. And this work is particularly striking in this context because it very neatly preempts the famous diagrams that Ebenezer Howard published a whole generation later. In other words, Arminius's book assembled for the first time a coherent reform program that featured all elements of the later Garden City movement, encompassing innovations in housing policy, urban and regional planning, legislation, financing, and organizational structure. It was eagerly received in the press and had a profound impact on the fledgling academic discipline of urban planning. However, today, it's also one of the least well-known treatises in the history of planning. And there's one major reason. Its author, the so-called architect Arminius, was not an architect at all, but a layperson and a woman. Countess Adelheid von Poninska, member of an old Protestant dynasty with land ownership in Silesia and Eastern Prussia, and with intimate connections to the Hohenzollern throne. What prompted Poninska to publish as Arminius? Unlike the later Garden City pioneers Howard and Fritsch, Poninska could have hardly hoped for worldly gain as a childless septuagenarian. Her work was inspired by moral responsibility. Her morality, in turn, was a product of her Protestant faith. Her book is littered with references to scripture. The two central themes of her thinking, The garden and the city had long been central elements of Christian theology. The city of God is repeatedly contrasted with the city of mankind in the Old Testament. Jerusalem has been idealized as such a city. St. Augustine wrote a treatise with the same title. Jesus' ministry was rural as much as it was urban, much of it carried out in unwalled small towns and villages, with cities being repeatedly portrayed as centers of violence. William Blake's Jerusalem, published in 1809, overlaid the wide spectrum of biblical urbanity onto the industrial metropolis, from the heavenly Jerusalem to the dark satanic mills that evoke Babylon, Sodom, and Gomorrah. England's green and pleasant land serves as an antithesis to the vices and clamour of the metropolis. And so the garden goes back in biblical imagery to Eden. It's idealized in the Song of Songs, where it portrays love, fruitfulness, and escape from the ordinary world. Panienska may have been an outsider to architecture and planning, but she was no outsider in the church. Quite the opposite, she was extremely well connected to some of the most recent developments in organized Protestantism. Her book is dedicated to the leaders and friends of the Inner Mission, the Innere Mission, which was a young group within the German churches founded at the 1848 National Congress of the Protestant Church in Wittenberg. Its initial purpose was social care and outreach in deprived metropolitan environments, but it quickly gained a devoted followership and developed into one of the most active and dynamic branches of German Protestantism. It lives on today under the new title, Diakonie. The Inner Mission benefited from a string of highly charismatic leaders. First of all, its founder, the Hanseatic pastor Johann Heinrich Wichern, a near contemporary of Panienska's. The generation that followed him was dominated by clergymen with political ambitions, such as Adolf Stöcker, court chaplain to the Prussian throne and head of the Berlin branch of the Inner Mission. A third important figure was the eccentric Friedrich von Bodelschwingh, a man known in the imperial capital for his habit of unpredictably entering political meetings to address dignitaries with the informal German Du. And this picture of Bodelschwingh, taken in his later life, says a lot about his legendary status. He's been a household name ever since. The son of a Prussian finance minister and an intimate friend of the later Emperor Friedrich III, was one of the most unusual aristocrats and arguably one of the most unusual men in Imperial Germany. As the director of the Inner Mission in the city of Bielefeld, Bodelschwingh was attuned, like Panienska, to the problems facing Germany's industrializing centers. Homelessness and, by extension, churchlessness were on the rise. To address these challenges, Bodelschwingh turned to one of the most prominent problem groups at the time, vagabonds, young single men without fixed abode who roamed the streets of Germany's industrializing regions. On a walk through the parks of Potsdam with Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, Bodelschwingh developed the idea of the workers' colony, a planned extra-urban settlement that would provide housing, agricultural work, and spiritual guidance to such young men. The term was adopted from Panienska's work, as were many of its ingredients: the drive to take housing out of the city and into the countryside, beyond pollution and urban vices, the importance placed on greenery and healthy surroundings, and lastly, the integration of agricultural production with affordable housing. Bodelschwingh founded the first of a whole string of workers' colonies in 1882 at Wilhelmsdorf. Others followed. By the eve of the First World War, Berlin was surrounded by a veritable ring of inner mission settlements. Workers' colonies were modest compared to some of the later garden cities, while Bodelschwingh envisaged settlements of 30,000 inhabitants, exactly like Ebenezer Howard's garden city, by the way. Few of them exceeded the dimension of a suburban village in practice. Nevertheless, their rapid expansion proliferated the idea across a vast geographical area, from the Rhineland to Silesia, from Bavaria to Eastern Prussia. 2 years after the first foundation, there were already 20 workers' colonies in the German Empire. And by 1900, more than 116,000 young men had been admitted and graduated from Bodelschwingh's colonies. Rather like the early garden city, the workers' colony enabled total control over all aspects of colonists' lives. House rules were coherent across all working colonies and obeyed a strict pattern: no alcohol, limited consumption of tobacco, strict rules regarding personal and domestic hygiene, hours of work, rest, and prayer. The fundamental objection to intoxicating substances would become another central element of Howard's garden cities. Early garden cities famously lacked pubs, but had community centers instead on purpose. Their physical confinement allowed designers unprecedented control over almost every aspect of the inhabitants' everyday lives. This is one of the reasons that made the concept behind the garden city so attractive to ideologists of all guises. Following the success of his colonies, Bodelschwingh tried to expand his scope. He envisaged settlements similar to Wilhelmsdorf, but for families rather than just for single men, and for permanent rather than temporary residents. In a letter to the Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, Bodelschwingh prophesied, quote, that in 30 to 40 years, every hardworking factory worker can have his supper in front of his own house, under his apple tree, surrounded by his family. Oh. Sorry, we're back. The idea of the detached, self-contained workers' house renewed the Protestant paradigm of family life as a bedrock of religious society. And this quote with the apple tree may evoke the famous Lutheran quote of, "If the world ended tomorrow, I'd still plant an apple tree today." Bodelschwingh founded the Verein Arbeiterheim to finance extra urban settlements with low-cost homes, each with its own garden. The Verein built 400 workers' houses outside Bielefeld, which attracted workers, artisans, teachers, and civil servants. What was special here was the model of cooperative ownership. After the death of a resident, houses would revert to the collective ownership of the Verein, which meant that potential capital gains were retained among the cooperative. The cooperative, originally a British invention, had been popularized in Germany by the Protestant convert and Inner Mission member Victor Emil Huber, a close friend of the Inner Mission founder Wichern, and a man who would become highly influential with Peninska in particular. In 1847, Huber founded the Berliner Gemeinnützige Wohnungsgenossenschaft to deliver low-cost housing for up to 500 families. In practice, the model did not take off until Bodelschwingh got involved. He campaigned for a reform of Germany's archaic cooperative law and had quite an impact. Shortly after the death of his personal friend, the Emperor Friedrich III, the successor Wilhelm II implemented the empire's second cooperative law, which freed cooperatives' members from personal liability. Only this triggered a veritable explosion in building cooperatives, whose number rose by factor 40 from 1888 to 1910. Also known as Bodelschwing'sche Bausparkassen, building cooperatives sprung up all over the German Empire. They would form the foundation for the German Garden City movement. Cooperative capital enabled the development of garden cities throughout the empire in the early 20th century. One example is the garden city of Stockfeld. And I'm trying to get to my next slide. Here we are. Stockfeld outside Strasbourg, built and marketed by the Gemeinnützige Baugenossenschaft, a cooperative after the Bodelschwinghian model. Its founder, Alexander von der Goltz, was a member of the board of the Protestant Church in Alsace-Lorraine and one of Bodelschwingh's many faithful disciples. His brother, the agricultural economist Theodor von der Goltz, coincidentally, had been the man who had endorsed Peninska's 1874 book with a preface. Goltz, whose entire family was bound up in the Protestant church, his younger brother was Prussia's highest ranking clergyman at the time, had met Bodelschwingh at a convention for the propagation of workers' colonies in 1883. The long-lived connection between the two men shows both the cohesiveness and political impact of the Inner Mission. especially in comparison with the German Garden City Association, a loosely organized and notably small group which provided specialist guidance in the making of Stockfeld. The Inner Mission was an extremely influential task force and a practical conduit of the Garden City concept in Germany. It deserves new attention. Now, there were strong strategic reasons for the Inner Mission to put its mark on the Garden City idea. Through much of the 1890s, the mission was struggling to find a coherent political stance. Unlike the Catholics, Germany's Protestants were still failing to convert their following into democratic participation. Court chaplain Adolf Stöcker, for example, depicted here with Bodelschwing, a lifelong friend, began to appropriate the annual conventions of the Inner Mission as a platform for his increasingly open anti-Semitic rhetoric, which he hoped to convert into party political following. But he soon found himself challenged by a younger rival. To speak of Friedrich Naumann as a Saxon pastor would be similarly misleading as to refer to the later leader of Germany as an Upper Austrian painter of picture postcards. Naumann was a phenomenal charismatic. The pastor Georg Schott, an early confidant of Hitler, saw in him the first preacher of the economic technological age, and the writer Wilhelm Hausenstein called him the most powerful ideologist of Wilhelmine Germany. Naumann rose to fame as an activist of the Inner Mission. In overt opposition to Stöcker, he developed a national but quintessentially liberal political program, a third way between socialism and far-right resentment. In 1895, he stopped preaching altogether and entered professional politics. In 1896, he founded the National Social Association, an organization that assembled some of the most exciting reform thinking of the age, especially in the field of housing reform. In the same year, the anti-Semite Fritsch published his book on the Garden City. And urban reform, once and for all, entered the political discourse. Much like Naumann had opposed Stöcker within the Inner Mission, he opposed Fritsch's racially motivated Garden City plans by nurturing a liberal alternative. He found a receptive platform in the German Garden City Association, a loosely organized group more drawn to the Book of Howard than that of its German precursor. It initially understood itself as a lobby group, a Propagandagesellschaft, rather than as an active developer of garden cities. But it was Naumann's contribution that first connected the association to large-scale attempts at actually building garden cities. Together with his friend, the philanthropic entrepreneur Carl Schmidt, Naumann developed plans for what would become Hellerau Garden City outside Dresden. It was him who attained the support and contribution of Hermann Mathesius, a renowned expert on British architecture and a self-avowed ardent Naumannite. And again, it was Naumann who appointed the man to implement the project of Hellerau, Wolf Dorn, an ex-activist in his political party. Naumann's political activity helped Howard's ideas to find fertile ground, while Fritsch's garden city theory receded without direct resonance. Naumann could draw on an unparalleled network of like-minded liberals throughout the empire, such as Rudolf Schwander, the youthful mayor of Strasbourg, on whom he impressed the benefits and indeed the need of founding a garden city on his frequent visits in the early 1900s. Ever the networker, Naumann gave not only the intellectual impulse for Germany's first garden cities, he also, in the case of Strasbourg, helped the mayor Schwander secure funding for Stockfeld via the building cooperative of the Inner Mission activist and Bodelschwing acolyte Alexander von der Goltz. Now, if the Protestant connection is so central, why is it that the garden city appears today to embody secular modernity? Ironically, one of the reasons why Germany's garden cities, like their British counterparts, have no parish churches, but only community centers, is the influence of Pastor Naumann. He rejected the idea of conventional parish churches arguing that Christianity had to develop into what he called a social religion. Religiosity should pervade all aspects of life in the Garden City. Art, music, and philosophy could transport religious meaning just as well, so much so that a dedicated church building would become, in his words, pointless and purely a waste of money. Naumann envisaged replacing traditional church buildings with multi-confessional, multi-purpose assemblies. As a matter of fact, the apparent secularism of Germany's garden cities was due to his desire to develop a mass-compatible modern version of Protestantism. Concluding, the Protestant connection rebundles some of the most important ideas that led to the flourishing of the Garden City movement in the German Empire. This perspective establishes more clearly not only how the idea could develop and grow over several decades. While there was never a coherent Protestant perspective on the Garden City, the inner mission proved phenomenally successful at drawing together and channeling a rich array of urban reform initiatives. The inner mission assembled otherwise disparate theorists, seasoned practitioners, and budding politicians. The intensity of personal, practical, and intellectual connections between people like Peninska, Bodelschwingh, the Goltz family, and Naumann ensured that progressive ideas, no matter how otherwise incongruous, were listened to, taken up, tested in practice, revised, or revisited. It was the inner mission that produced, discussed, and put into practice many of the core elements of the Garden City movement, long before Howard and Fritsch. And it was the influence of the inner mission that transported these ideas into the political mainstream. One of the reasons that Howard found such enthusiastic uptake in Germany was the inner mission activist Naumann, who consciously tried to wrest the movement from its anti-Semitic claims. The German Garden City never belonged exclusively to the realm of racists and eugenicists, and it deserves new attention. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, both of you. And I just in the last minute thought of a combining theme. Finally, all throughout your presentation, I thought, how can we combine these two amazing but very different talks? And I think secularity or apparent secularity might be one of them. But before I, as the Germans say, gebe meine Senf dazu, before I jump in with questions and comments, I would like our, as you called it, the happy few. What did you say? The select few. Well, in any case, our esteemed audience, if any of them would like to raise a question or a discussion point or a comment, I think because we're so few, we can really just all unmute ourselves if we want to and just jump in and see if we want to have an actual discussion or if we want to ask the speakers questions. I think everything is allowed, basically.
I wanted to raise a question.
Please do.
Not to myself, obviously, but to Philipp. Thank you very much for this talk. I really enjoyed it. And this combining of intellectual history and urban theory is really, really great. I wanted you to say some more about the idea of Eden. Because if I'm correct, if I understood it correctly, the urban, the garden city rests on the idea of restoration of Eden. And you connect that with Protestantism. But then you said that there is some English connection, and interestingly, in English. Empiricist philosophers, there is the idea of restoring the pre-lapsarian status of man, and this. So, I mean, the idea of the lost Eden you find in a context where you don't expect to find theological ideas whatsoever and biblical ideas. So could you say more about this this context? Where does this idea come from? Why and why in England, through England?
Well, just a bit to why I cite Blake there is that I believe a lot of these Protestant reactions, or reactions generally against the industrializing metropolis, start earlier in England than anywhere else. And then you have people like Thomas Spence, who respond with various purely utopian or more practical, in the case of the Cadburys, attempts to rescue the masses from the vices of the industrializing city. And I think that I get the impression that German thinkers such as Poninsky, but also Huber and the people writing around 1848 look to England a great deal for that sort of environment. Poninsky, for example, had visited England. She was in correspondence with Lord Shaftesbury. She almost certainly knew various English, British reform strands. It's very interesting what you raise, because I haven't focused so much on the intellectual or biblical background of this idea of restoring Eden. What for me stood in the foreground was this real fear that with urbanization, the church might just lose the working classes. And, you know, in places like Berlin, marriage rates were dangerously low. Children were born out of wedlock. I think something close to 50%. And there was, I think, a real sense of a crisis of traditional parish-based church activity, and therefore a need to do something radically new. And taking the workers out of the city was a tremendously promising first step, certainly. In how much that then succeeded is a different question. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
All right, I can kind of jump in with my unifying observation. It's to me at least, it's the fascination with one particular aspect of your talk, Smilen, when you spoke about the way that Edith Stein, but also her school of history of philosophy, engaged past thinkers and past thoughts, which you describe as almost as interlocutors, not so much as authorities, but and then even God becomes the Urtheologe, becomes the original theologian, and in some way, this is also an avenue for secularizing God, but also, you know, Christ himself in a really interesting way that comes from within theology, because in a way there's nothing more dangerous to religion than history, or historicizing the Bible and the characters of the Bible. And it is, I mean, it's obviously not primarily intended, or maybe not at all intended, but there is this possibility in there of it's kind of a submerged secularizing strand. And with Philipp, it is quite the opposite, right? It is a submerged religiosity that is embedded in the Garden City. So you have Edith Stein and like a kind of submerged possibility of secularization in her arguments that historicize, engage even God productively. I mean, how do you engage God productively? You have to kind of historicize. You have to kind of make him a person in some ways. And with Philipp is the opposite. So that was my my unifying thought. And then for you, Smilen, the question I would have is, was she perceived in any way like this? Was there criticism from theologians that said, let's not go down this avenue because it might lead to weird concepts of God, where we engage God in ways that he's not supposed to be engaged in? You know, don't talk of God like the Urtheologe, because in fact he's not. He's the creator, but not a theologian. And for Philipp, I think my question's also a comment in the way that I would question the dichotomy that you build between what you call the right, and as part of that, you quote Plötz and Heckel. And I believe that these are not really good examples. A, they're not anti-Semites, so calling them anti-Semites is factually incorrect. And B, I think they have quite a fascinating, at least Heckel, you know, he's the monist, the founder of monism. So he is himself quite a specific religious understanding or perception of the world. And then Plötz is a student of Auguste Forel, who himself was a Protestant, who is one of the founders of eugenics. And then they tried to, in similar ways, maybe combine religion and society, in that they're not so far from Neumann at all, and maybe not so far from Reformed Protestantism at all. So I think maybe they all kind of want to do the same, rather than want to do something particularly different. But I guess it's not a real question. Yeah. So those will count my thoughts. Yeah.
If I may answer. I mean, secularizing, I find a bit problematic because of the connotations of secularism. What she aims at is an opening, and an opening between theological knowledge and natural knowledge. And she points to the Urtheologie as an example for this opening. So she would say that actually in Christian tradition, in the core of it is this opening to the world. So a secularization in this positive sense of encounter between God and the world. But she won't see that as a demarcation line between the sacred and the unsacred, or the late system, the hostility between laicism and clergy and so on. And then, of course, was it criticized? Yes, yes. The very project of rekindling the scholastic tradition was taken a dim view by many, theologians who were happy with some kind of consensus between, or at least a demarcation of the spheres of competence between a modern science, modern philosophy, and theology. And here we have a demand, a claim of comprehensive synthesis between philosophy and theology that actually came as a scandal not only to philosophers, which we expect, but also to theologians. Because they said, why shall we tackle now again, time and again, issues that seem solved? Everything is clear. We have our domains of competence. Let's stick to them, and let's not allow anybody to trespass. And actually, she was following a completely different strategy. Not only she, Grabman and this school. They were criticized by the so-called neo-Thomism, which was more or less, let's say, an ideological reading of the tradition for the convenience of the current status quo. These people wanted to raise the old questions and find new perspectives. This was criticized, and I think to some extent this approach still causes dissent and debates. And because other followers of her approach, such as Przeworra, her colleague Edith Przeworra, he is a very controversial figure. Then you have Hans Urs von Balthasar, who was again a person who tried to achieve a synthesis between Eastern and Western theology, answering burning philosophical questions, addressing the philosophical tradition, engaging in dialogue with phenomenology, with existential philosophy even. Before that, you have Maritain, Jacques Maritain. All these figures were and are controversial, but they were very creative. And ideas, and such as, for example, a human rights concept, which was fundamental for the development of Europe after the Second World War, is pretty much indebted to this, what I call Christian humanism. And this Christian humanism had also this, especially in Germany, this historical, so to say, root and historical motivation. But history, not in the sense of studying archives for the, I don't know, in order to make a museum. History is, studying history is for them philosophizing, because ideas develop, they reveal throughout the trajectory of history. And then this is again a point where you can address theology and theological questions. They come as pertinent philosophical questions. Thank you.
And if I can just take over, thank you, Konstantin, for your comments, which really challenged me, because I think I have to be very precise with the distinction that this man Fritsch, who published the German Garden City theory, was an anti-Semite, of the nastiest kind. But then, as you point out with Haeckel and Plötze, it wouldn't be fair to just subsume them under the same umbrella. I suppose what I did by introducing them in the same sentence is to show that I think past perspectives on the Garden City have bundled up these problematic people, be they, anti-Semites, eugenicists, racial hygienicists, and I believe that really has been one of the reasons why this whole topic has been so little explored. But then, of course, going forward, you're right that I need to be more nuanced with what I propose instead, and that, of course, and I could add that Naumann himself, who had some, by the end of his life, had some pretty wacky ideas on Protestantism. So, he was hardly an Orthodox Lutheran, as it were. But you could also class him into the ranks of people who really departed with their religious ideas radically from traditional Christianity. And then that raises the question, why does it make sense then to introduce this term Protestantism into this debate? Am I not just bundling up people in another way where they've been bundled up in a different corner before? But I believe it, introducing this concept and summing people as diverse as Naumann, Paninska, etc., up under this just gives a new angle onto the problem, which, as you say, doesn't mean that what's not Protestant is as simple as holistically anti-Semitic.
See what I mean? I don't think that was primarily my problem. I think there's, maybe I should speak of potential. I think there is the possibility to motivate a new engagement with the Garden City, not so much because we missed a more tame aspect of its origins. So I don't think that you need to motivate your research by kind of claiming out of a Verharmlosung der Gartenstadt or something like that. Like, I don't think it's necessary. I think, to the contrary, you can use it as an example to show. And I think Protestantism, well, what I got from your stuff was more this Reformed Protestantism, really, the intermission and this, a reformist attitude towards religion and society, towards combining the two in new ways. to me at least, this seemed to be, rather than a distinguishing feature between people like Haeckel and Plötz and Naumann and what's the other person called? Bolschwing?
Driesmann.
Bodelschwing.
Bodelschwing, sorry.
Bodelschwing. Rather than a distinguishing feature between them, this reformist kind of Geist, that is also very much so part of the fin de siècle and the decades around it. It can really shine an interesting new light on the connections between those people. So in a way that could be just, to me at least, it would be a fine motivation for research that engages the Gartenstadt to say something really fascinating about what kind of drove urban planning. But I don't know how the others view it. I mean, anybody feel free to jump in and and shoot some arrows. I know that Philip, and I don't know about you, Smilen, really want to also play this idea by us, so be as critical as you can.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Konstantin.
So are we all allowed to contribute?
Please, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess it's interesting that the ideological roots of the Garden City kind of lie in Protestant writings, because optically, well, I actually grew up in Hampstead suburb, and there, the houses optically, like the actual architectural style itself, is kind of heavily inspired by what is essentially Catholic architecture, because it's from Bavaria. You see these market towns like Württemberg, up there, Talbot, that's one of the most famous ones, of course. So I guess it's kind of interesting to see how Catholic optics combine with like Protestant ideology. And I'm just kind of like wondering, like, perhaps why Garden City designers perhaps didn't look to Protestant optics for inspiration instead. Like, they could have looked perhaps at red brick Gothic. I'm not entirely sure. So I'm just kind of trying to see where that kind of juxtaposition arose from.
That's a fascinating question. I've never thought about it. There's one sort of direct reason, and of course we could talk about what lies at the bottom of this. So there's a tremendously influential book in 1889 by a Viennese called Camillo Sitte, that really turns urban planning round. It's called Urban Planning According to Artistic Principles, and it's a tremendous bestseller. It challenges much of what used to be planning practice so far, and Sitte looks at cities like Württemberg, Ob der Tauber, Bavarian market towns, and analyzes them visually. And draws heavily on that kind of heritage, with consequences in England, where his book was equally popular. So that is a clear pathway towards that kind of aesthetics. I'm thinking beyond that. Why doesn't he look at Protestant cities? Why doesn't he look at northern German Hanseatic towns, which may be visually as attractive? I'm sort of thinking of Weber, and I'm thinking of the rise of the commercial city, and ultimately the industrializing city as something that's perhaps seen as linked to the forces of Protestantism, vis-a-vis a pre-industrial world of Bavaria or Austria that Camillo Sitte is looking at. I wonder what others think of this. But yeah,
I would agree with. I guess I didn't think about it that way. Like, I guess Protestant optics are inextricably linked, especially post Weber, with industrialization. And what we get in the garden suburb movement is kind of like this utopian romanticism, which it makes sense that they would want to look towards. The less industrialized southern German regions? Thanks for the answer.
Thank you.